And I would like to also thank Cititzens County Audubon. And I'll say our environment one more time. We are hosting these great people right here. And I'm going to turn it over to John to get the program started.
Thank you, Sylvia. And welcome everybody this afternoon to our presentation, Water, Wind, and Fire, Preserving Our Farms, Fish, and Forests while Strengthening the Economy. We want to talk about some changes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Good. Some changes that we see in our climate and the consequences and maybe some things that we can do about it. Let me grab it. See if this works. Great. So first off, I want to make clear that we're doing this project by visiting a number of communities throughout the state of Washington. We are now on the second of 12 tour stops on the tour. It's a joint project between an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, for which I'm a volunteer, and Audubon, Washington. So we have this wonderful partnership between our two organizations. Just a quick word on Citizens Climate Lobby. We'll talk more about it later. This is an all-volunteer organization that is dedicated to building the political will for a livable world. And I personally, as you see here from the chart, I'm an aeronautical engineer by training, an aerospace executive for 35 years in the industry. I've been concerned about a changing climate for much of my adult life. But until very recently, wasn't very active, didn't do anything about it, mostly because I didn't know what to do. I wasn't aware of any policy or actions that I might be able to take that I thought could really be practically effective. But through Citizens Climate Lobby, I came to learn of a policy, which we will talk about a little bit later, that I find really exciting. And it has just completely energized me, given me the motivation to get involved in this process, because I'm very concerned about my children and their children, my grandchildren, having an opportunity to enjoy a natural world like I have been so privileged to enjoy, and I want to preserve that.
So I'm Steve Ghan. I am a climate scientist. I live in Richland. And I got my degrees in atmospheric science initially because I like to hike. I don't like to hike in the rain. So I've had this career, and in the course of my career, I've come to the conclusion that the climate is warming and that human activities are driving that. And that conclusion, which I share with 97% of all other climate scientists, is not influenced by my politics. In fact, I voted for both Bushes for president. I did not vote for Al Gore. But the science, the data, it leads us to this conclusion of human role in climate change. So after we came to that conclusion, I was surprised to find confusion in the public about this consensus of the climate scientists. And so I started giving presentations to the public about the science of climate change. And then I learned about Citizens Climate Lobby, and I thought, wow, this is what we need, because we need a durable solution to climate change that doesn't depend on which party is in control of government. And so it has to appeal to both parties. And the legislative solution that you'll hear about today meets that criteria. So I'm very excited about that, and I'm really happy to be here with you today to talk more about it.
I'm Jen. I am the Chapter Conservation Manager with the Audubon, Washington State Office. And if you don't know Audubon, we are friends of birds. And I have the privilege of working with an incredible network across Washington State. We have a national network, but I have the privilege of working with 25 independent chapters here in Washington State. And right here in your backyard is Cititzens Audubon Society. And I see a number of you in the audience. Thank you for being here. So the other thing you might not know about Audubon is that we are a centrist organization. We have a moderate legacy. If we look across our chapter network across the country today, 48% of our membership identifies as conservative or right-leaning, and 52% identify as progressive or left-leaning. And we value that bipartisan perspective that we can bring to the table, and a long legacy of such. We're over 100 years old. So we are, like John said, we are on our third stop across Washington. We've been in Yakima and Richland, and today we are in Ellensburg. It's going to be a long tour. Pardon me, thank you. So let's get started. Let's ask a question. What if? What if our changing climate, as we're seeing it today, threatens our ability to ski and snowshoe and snowmobile in the winter? And the soil moisture and the level of water in the rivers and our groundwater prevents adequate irrigation of our fields and our crops. And what if the primary cause of that is us burning ancient dinosaurs in the form of coal and oil and natural gas? But what if we could not use those ancient dinosaurs anymore and use renewable energies instead, and still grow the economy at the same time? So move into the 21st century without hurting our pocketbooks. This chart, you may have seen before, outlines the temperature over the past 1,000 years. That's a long time. And we can see that it's been relatively consistent up until the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 1850s, when we really started burning a lot of those dinosaurs at a great rate. And there is a correlation with the temperature increase when we started pumping all that excess CO2 into the atmosphere. But I actually really love this illustration because this is a simple visualization of that data that really exemplifies that change. So blue is cold, red is hot, and you can see how quickly it has changed, and especially within the last, 30 years? I was born in 1982, and it is just through the roof since I've been on this planet. But you know what? You don't even have to look at the data. You don't even have to take the scientist's word for it. You can look out in your backyard. You can be the naturalist and observe the natural world around you, just like our forefathers, Teddy Roosevelt, Aldo Leopold, Native American elders. These people with a keen sense of a relationship with the land. And they easily see this change that's happening in the response of the animals and the warmer waters. You don't have to be a climate scientist to understand that this is going on. How many of you like fishing? Yeah. So these salmon like, as you know, fast-running cold water. And as our climate warms, that water is getting warmer, and the salmon are suffering. It exposes them, makes them more susceptible to disease and death and decreased populations. And we all recognize salmon as an iconic species of the Pacific Northwest. And for a few years now, especially in 2015, there was some dramatic, some alarming drop in those numbers in the rivers. And guess who else is telling us that the climate is changing? Birds. So birds have been indicators of environmental health for a very long time. That canary in a coal mine metaphor, that's a real thing. They used to send canaries into coal mines to detect toxic levels of methane and other toxic gases so that the miners could get out before they suffocated. When the bald eagle was threatened, we made a connection between the pesticide DDT and the softness of the eagle eggs and their perishing. And today, we see a dramatic change with the birds behavior. So this graphic shows that over the last 50 years, 60% of North American wintering bird species have shifted their range northward. Simply, the climate blanket, so the comforter that they enjoy, is getting too hot, and they're having to move northward in order to find more tolerable temperatures and levels of precipitation. And in fact, in 2014, the National Audubon Society released a report that said climate change is, in fact, the #1 threat to birds. And 314 North American bird species may be endangered or go extinct by 2080, towards the end of the century. And if you want to know if your favorite bird is on that list, I can look it up for you afterwards. But the point is that we're seeing the changes today, and we're predicting dramatic changes into the future.
50 of them are here in Cititzens County.
50 of those species are here in Cititzens County. Thank you, Judy Hallisey, President of Cititzens Audubon Society. So, Dr. Steve, why are these things happening?
Yeah, so, the next slide here. Yeah, so the climate, we've seen the data showing a rapid warming in the last 150 years, and we want to understand that so we can decide how to deal with it. And it's helpful to look at the past. How many of you have heard the expression, climate's always been changing? Yeah? Well, you know, it's true. The climate has always been changing. During the ice ages, it was much colder, and then there were interglacial periods, and then if you look further back, 100 million years ago, the dinosaurs were roaming, and it was much warmer. And almost every time the climate has changed, we know that carbon dioxide has changed with it. In fact, we cannot explain past climate change without accounting for the influence of carbon dioxide and methane. They're both greenhouse gases. Okay? Now, the driver of that is, the driver of the recent warming is our use of fossil fuels, which are emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We have coal, we have oil, we have natural gas. And our use of those fossil fuels have increased a lot since the Industrial Revolution, and that has jacked up concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane, and that is driving the warming. The mechanism is what we call the greenhouse effect, which that involves the energy balance of the planet. So we have incoming solar energy, we have outgoing terrestrial radiation emitted from the surface, and greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, and they absorb the terrestrial radiation emitted from the surface, and they radiate it back down, and that produces the warming effect. In fact, this natural greenhouse effect makes our planet 70 degrees warmer than it would be without greenhouse gases. Yours would be a snowball. So, in the last 150 years, carbon dioxide has risen 40%, and methane has tripled, and that has led to an enhanced greenhouse effect that is driving a warming of, so far, of 1.5 degrees, just a very small amount compared with the 70 degrees natural greenhouse effect. And that can continue to rise as the concentrations of those greenhouse gases accumulate. So that's the science, and it's agreed upon by 97% of climate scientists. It's well established. The physics is very sound. The public acceptance of the science is not so strong. Let's talk about that. There is data collected by the Yale Center for Climate Communications, and they have done this analysis county by county for the whole U.S. And this chart here shows the agreement with the statement that global warming is happening. And what you see is 71% of people in Cititzens County agree with that statement. Nationwide, it's 66%. So it's a fairly strong consensus with the conclusion that the climate is warming. Now, the acceptance of the statement that warming is caused by human activities is not so strong. It's about 50%. In this county, 54%. So why is that acceptance of the human role not so strong as the warming itself? Two reasons. First, the science is a bit more complicated because you have to attribute that warming to the increase in greenhouse gases. And there are other potential mechanisms that could explain the warming. There could be changes in the solar constant, changes in volcanic emissions, or cosmic rays, aerosols. And so the climate scientists had to consider each of these potential mechanisms. And they found that none of them could explain the warming in the lower atmosphere and the cooling which we observe in the upper atmosphere, except greenhouse gases. So that's the conclusion. The second reason there is less agreement with this statement is that there has been a public coordinated campaign to confuse the public about the science of climate change. The fossil fuel industry has a vested interest in continuing to burn fossil fuels, and they have funded a campaign. In fact, they funded the production of this report called Climate Change Reconsidered by the Non-Governmental Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced by the Heartland Institute. And there's all sorts of sciencey stuff in here. In fact, they talk about some of my own work. They get it wrong. So that's what's going on. There's a book that describes this campaign and others, other issues, environmental issues, such as the ozone hole, acid rain, and the link between smoking and lung cancer. A book called Merchants of Doubt explains how there are a group of people that become quite skilled in confusing the public. So I highly recommend this book if you want to understand that campaign. Okay, so this just came out in the paper yesterday. Yet another report by the scientific community reconfirming this conclusion of the human role in climate change. And it's actually surprising to me that it got published. But there it is. All right, now let's look at a warmer world. What does it look like? How does it impact us? In places where it's just cold enough for snow, for precipitation to fall as snow, in a warmer world, that precipitation falls as rain. Falls on the ground and it washes out to sea. When it does snow, that snow will melt out earlier in the year, in the spring or early summer rather than later in the summer. So that snow melt is not available for irrigation in the summer. The river flows in the summer become low. They're higher in the winter and spring, potential for some flooding, but in the summer you have less river flow. This is actually the Tianaway River in 2015. And that reduces the water available for irrigating our crops, and it also dries the soil, and that contributes to the spread of wildfire. There are other factors involved too, but the drier soil certainly doesn't help. The fires burn hotter, the plumes rise higher, more smoke is put in the atmosphere. Who remembers the smoke from last summer? And the fires burn wider. This is the Carlton Complex fire of 2014. At that time, it was the largest wildfire in Washington State history. Until the next year, when the Okanagan fire was even larger. And then the warming also warms the water, and that affects fish. This is a sturgeon. In the Columbia River, we lost 66 sturgeon in the summer of 2015. Such a hot year. And of course, hard-on salmon. And the birds are sensitive to the warming. This is Barrow's goldeneye, and its range is affected. Here we have the range of the Barrow's goldeneye in winter in blue and summer in yellow. By 2080, we have a 73% reduction in the range of barrel goldeneye in the winter and a 97% reduction in its range during the summer. Where is it going to during the summer? I don't know. All right, now let's really bring this home to the summer of 2015. Who was here in 2015? So let's recall what happened there. This is Cutchless Lake. Everyone knows where Cutchless Lake is? In June 2015, this is a photo of it. This is really what it normally looks like in August, after it's released its water for irrigation during the summer. But it just didn't have any water because there wasn't snow, less than half of normal snow that year. And so there it is. And this was a major source of irrigation for the Yakima River. And so Scott Rebell, who manages the Rosa Irrigation District in the Yakima Valley, had a tough decision to make. He knew he did not have enough water to meet the needs of customers in August. So he made a tough decision. He decided to shut down the Rosa Irrigation Canal for 2 weeks in May. And that had effects. People with junior water rights lost their hops. They lost orchards. All told, there was $700 million in agricultural loss that year. Now, it was an awful year. But the good thing about it is that it provides us a window of what the future holds. This would be the new normal by the end of this century if we don't act to prevent climate change. So let's learn from that experience. Oh, yes, the fires. This is the Okanagan Complex Fire. 3 lives lost, lots of homes and outbuildings. Really devastating. So I'd like you to take some time now and think about your memories of the summer of 2015 and your feelings about that time. I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and talk about your memories and feelings from that summer. And ask yourself, is this the sort of future I want to leave to my grandchildren? So take a minute, each of you, and talk to your neighbor. So I'm wondering if some of you would like to share what you recall from that summer. What really sticks in your mind? What really bothers you about that summer? Who would like to speak? You have a microphone?
Yeah.
Who wants to share? Anybody? Here we go.
I had a prepared statement that I wrote, if you would care.
We'll have-
Not exactly on the same line as what you're talking
We'll
about.
have plenty of time to talk generally a little bit later.
Is this about that summer?
It's about the
No,
summer.
it's just a thing about this whole climate change.
Okay,
and cost.
we'll get to that later.
We'll get to that.
Just
Okay.
hold on.
Anybody else about 2015? Here we go.
I raised grass-fed beef out north of Cititzens. Wasn't good when the water went off the 1st of August.
Oh.
You got yourself 22 pairs of cows with calves and no pasture, and the price of hay going up, up, up. The only thing that was good, I wasn't having to pay the PUD bill.
Wow.
Thank you. Anybody else? Here we go.
I just remember feeling sad for the sockeye salmon, which was, you showed a picture of fish, and those are the gorgeous, iconic sockeye salmon, and they can't make it through the lower 100 miles of the Yakima River when it's warm. They migrate in the summer, and they move really fast when they move. They're really speedy upstream migrants, so they wait for a cold water cue, when we get a little bit of rain or a little dip down in the temperatures, and then they race up. And it's, with climate change, it's just not going to happen. That's what I feel.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'm Howard Lyman, I'm chairman of the High Valley and Brick Road Cemetery. In 2015, we had no water, and the cemetery was brown, and everybody was asking, why in the world isn't it green? We're just trying to get everybody ready for what's going to happen in the future, because there's going to be a lot of brown, and people are going to wonder, why in the world did this happen and I didn't know about it? The nice thing about this gathering is you can never again say you didn't know about it.
Hi, I'm Judy Halsey, and I'm retired Forest Service. And so I'm intimately involved with wildfire. In 2015, I've got two strong memories. One is our resources were in such short supply that they brought in crews from Australia and New Zealand. I was able to renew friendships from firefighters that I knew from Australia that summer. But unfortunately, I'm also very good friends with the Zabinski family of the Methow, and as you may recall, they lost their son that summer in the Twist Fire. And I remember the memorials and the great sadness of losing those 3 young lives.
Thank you. Anyone else? One last voice? Okay, Steve.
All right. So, these impacts are very costly on economic terms and in terms of aesthetics and health. We'd like to avoid them. So, there are other risks in life that we deal with. Risk of an auto accident, a house fire, or health problems. And they're more expensive than most of us have a family budget for. And so, to protect ourselves, we take out insurance and get reimbursed for those costs when they happen. And these things are not very likely. What's the likelihood of your house burning in your lifetime? It's pretty low, but we still take out house insurance, don't we? Because the impacts can be devastating. So climate change is like that. It's a large risk, a huge risk. We're not absolutely certain what all the impacts will be, but there's a pretty good likelihood that a lot of them will happen. So it makes sense to take out an insurance policy to protect us from climate change. That's what John's going to talk about.
Thanks, Steve. So we've heard about the science. I suspect there may yet be some controversy in the room, but we believe and we know that the science shows unequivocally the climate is warming because of human-caused fossil fuels. So, okay, that's a tough problem. what do we do about it? Whoops, sorry. One of the things that we do is we take a page out of the playbook of Audubon, Washington. You know, the Audubon Society is dedicated to preserving habitat and the environment, specifically for birds. But more than that, we know that what's good for birds is good for humans as well. So there's a lot of parallel overlap here, sort of parallel reinforcing policies that we can adopt. And one of the things that we all sort of agree on is to address carbon emissions, reduce them in order to control climate change. We saw some opinion data about your neighbors here in Cititzens County a little bit earlier. Here's one that might surprise you. Nearly 3/4 of your neighbors here believe that it's appropriate to take some kind of action to reduce CO2 pollution. Okay, so that's interesting news, I think, for many of us who think that, who have an opinion that there is a non-consensus about the need to take action. 3 out of 4 of your neighbors think it's the right thing to do. So one of the things that we think about as well when we talk about carbon pollution and the consequences of it is who's paying for it? You know, when you buy a tank of gas or, you know, natural gas or heating oil to heat your home, you get a bill from the oil company, obviously. But there are consequences of that. The environmental, and some estimates you see here of environmental consequences, health consequences, national security consequences. If we talked about the environmental consequences, I think we've seen some very recent experience of hurricanes in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico. You know, those costs are going to amount to, collectively, between the 3 of them, more than $1 trillion. Those costs are going to be paid, for the most part, by taxpayers. So those costs get distributed to all of us anyway. Similar with respect to health costs. There are 13,000 early deaths that we're going to face every year as a consequence of CO2 pollution. Think about the national security implications. What we reference here is an estimate of what it costs for us to be able to maintain access to Middle East oil as our primary energy source. I mean, a lot of it is generated here in the United States now, of course, but we still import a considerable amount of oil and need access to that for a stable energy market. And the U.S. military ends up carrying a huge burden for that. But that's only part of the national security consequences. Let's think about, for instance, the fact that sea level is rising. It's already risen some, and it's projected to rise as much as 6 feet by the end of the century. Many of our military installations are going to be underwater. That's going to cost billions of dollars to rebuild that infrastructure, either build protections around it or move it. And then even more significantly than that is the instability that will develop worldwide as low-lying areas flood and people have to move. Those people are going to go someplace. You know, they have a right to secure lives as well, and they're going to move whether we want them to or not. And the result is going to be huge, unstable governments around the world. Some of them are going to come to the United States. And the military is going to be left holding the bag. That's going to end up being bunches of money that come out of the taxpayers' pockets. All of these are hidden costs of global warming caused by CO2 pollution. So we believe, well, first off, what can a person do to affect their CO2 contributions? We all have what we call a carbon footprint. And if you're here today, I can bet that you know a lot about your carbon footprint, or at least the principle of reducing your carbon footprint. We can all reduce that, and we should do that. That's a good thing to do. But in order to have the massive change that we think is required across the global economy to reduce and eventually actually eliminate fossil fuels, we need some kind of massive change that doesn't destroy our economy, doesn't destroy our way of life. It's hard to project that, but we know that by putting a price on a behavior that is undesirable, you change the behavior. So we put a price on carbon, or fossil fuel if you like, we know that that will affect people's behavior. If it becomes more expensive, they will choose some other form. We will all choose some other form of energy. Okay, well, that sounds good as far as it goes, but it sounds like, holy smokes, that could hurt the economy, that could hurt my personal standard of living, so forth. So, you know, there are a range of policy options that are available to us to try and do that. First off, doing nothing at all, other than, let's say, adapting to the changing climate. The climate's going to change. People are going to have to live with it some way or another. You know, that strategy doesn't even attempt to stop it. The other strategies there for regulation, cap and trade, and so on, those are all intended to try and reduce CO2 consumption, or fossil fuel consumption, and CO2 emissions, put it that way. Okay, and the last three on that list are all what I call market-based approaches that do not depend upon government telling us what to do. Each of those sets some kind of mechanism using market-based forces to influence people's choices. Cap and trade is one, carbon tax is another. We're going to talk a little bit more about carbon fee and dividend because it's unique in, I believe, in having, putting a price on carbon and having a powerful effect while also allowing people, while preserving our standard of living and allowing people to make individual choices. Okay, so I'm going to describe that in a little bit more detail. The way carbon fee and dividend works is first, we put a price on carbon and we call it a fee. We don't call it a tax, and I'll explain why in the next segment here in just a moment. We start at $15 a ton of CO2 equivalent fossil fuel, and every year we raise the price by $10 a ton. To put this in terms that are a little bit more intuitive, $15 a ton of CO2 equivalent, if we were talking about gasoline, would be about 15 cents a gallon. So the price would go up 15 cents a gallon. You know, at the end of 20 years, the price would be 15 plus 20 times 10, or $2.05 a gallon. $205 a ton, $2.05 a gallon for a gallon of gasoline, to put it in those kinds of terms. Okay, well, yikes, that sounds like a hit in my pocketbook. Yes, it is. We want to have a hit in your pocketbook. We want to influence behavior. We want fossil fuels to be expensive. But yet, doesn't that damage my standard of living? And the answer is given in the second segment of this policy, which is the dividend part. So we have a carbon fee, and then we have a dividend. All of the revenues that are raised in the form of the carbon fees come back to households as a dividend. All of it, minus a little bit for administrative costs, and that's a small fraction. So an individual or an individual household has as much money as they ever did. Prices go up for fossil fuel, probably prices go up for everything that uses fossil fuel in its production. But those monies are coming right back to you. So you're no worse off. It all balances out on a personal pocketbook perspective. So you ask yourself, well, okay, so why does that help? The reason it helps is because fossil fuel then is relatively expensive compared to any other energy form. So suddenly now you have an option to move to another energy form that used to be costly, but now is relatively affordable. We'll switch, all of a sudden, that makes good sense, right? Why would I pay more than I have to for my energy? So fossil fuel is expensive, and it's relatively expensive. You go to a relatively affordable fuel, and that's what we want. We want to move people to other forms of energy and make it affordable for them to do that. So that's the basic concept. And then there's another critical feature of our policy, and it has to do with international competition and global carbon emissions. And we call it the border adjustment. So a U.S. producer who has carbon fees applied, who wants to sell to an international market, because the carbon fees apply, his prices, in order to be profitable, have to increase, right? Well, that could destroy his competitiveness internationally if he wants to sell into a country where there are no carbon fees, right? We don't want U.S. producers to be uncompetitive. So to prevent that, we give him a rebate of those fees when he exports his product. So he has to sell internally in the U.S. With the fees applied, but so does everybody else. So it's even competition, fair competition in the U.S. But we want him to be competitive outside the U.S. And so we give him a rebate. And conversely, international producers would get the fee applied when their products come across the border. So they cannot sell at an advantage in the United States. So even competition, both in the U.S. market and in international markets. Then there's one other feature of the border adjustment that's really important, which is that because foreign producers will have a carbon fee applied when their products come to the U.S., we believe that foreign governments are going to look at that and say, wait a minute, you mean the U.S. is charging our producers a fee when we send their products to the U.S., but we could be charging that same fee and then they wouldn't apply it? Well, okay, yeah, we'll charge that fee at home so the U.S. doesn't collect it. Does that make sense? You following here? The idea is it gives foreign governments all the stimulation, all the stimulus they need to impose a similar kind of policy themselves, because if they don't, their producers are going to get zapped when they import to the United States. So that's it in a nutshell. It's about, I mean, it's just that simple. And we think it's going to be a powerful effect. It has the benefit of not depending upon regulation, allowing people to make their own choices, let free markets work, and it will stimulate other governments around the world to do their part as well. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask for any questions, because this is an important part of our talk. I want to make sure that it's comprehended well. I do ask that you limit your questions to the carbon fee and dividend proposal at this point. We'll have a more general discussion a little bit later. So any questions about CFD, carbon fee and dividend?
The one question that came to my mind is about your number 3, where you are imposing the fee on the manufacturer. What happens hopefully in the future as our dependency on fossil fuels decreases? I mean, I know that there's a lot in the works with electric vehicles, which will substantially reduce us as citizens, our use of fossil fuels. But with the manufacturers, do you have an end point in mind that after this date or this level of use of fossil fuels, this border-to-border fee will go away?
Yes. Yes, we do. First off, I don't think I made clear in the very first step that the fee gets applied on the fossil fuel where it gets pulled out of the ground. When it's mined as coal or extracted as a barrel of oil or a cubic foot of natural gas from the ground, the initial producer pays the fee. After that, there are no fees charged through the rest of the market. It's in the system at that point. The price is embedded, so whoever uses fossil fuel, whoever uses energy for any purpose at all, those costs are part of their cost structure. It just flows through the value stream and through the economy. Okay, so, but the price continues to increase year after year after year. It gets more and more and more expensive until CO2 emissions are 1/2 of what they were in 1995. At that point, the acceleration of the price stops. So in other words, You got a real high price for fossil fuel at that point, and you just don't keep increasing the price anymore. You just keep it at that level. That's the target that we have set in our policy ideal. And, you know, you could change that later on if you felt you needed to. But does that answer your question? Okay, good. Other questions?
Thank you. I'm all in favor of what you're suggesting, but I'm wondering if you have a response to a friend of mine who's a heavy equipment contractor. He employs around 25 people here in the valley, and he has a lot of really thirsty equipment that runs on diesel. Right.
Yes. Large fossil fuel consumers are going to have a relatively large impact, and that's the way we want it. Construction equipment operators, mining equipment operators, and you know, other than fossil fuel, including fossil fuel, agricultural operators. There's a lot of sectors that consume a lot of fossil fuel as part of their system. And what we believe is that the market will go to work to stimulate these alternate energy sources, like, for example, renewable biodiesel, as an example, that as the diesel becomes more expensive, the other fuels become relatively more affordable. What's more, it provides a business case, that's the term I use, for a business environment that stimulates entrepreneurs to do the R&D, to develop these alternate energy sources, and to scale up the industrial processes such that the economies of scale apply and they can really deliver them affordably. And that's what we think will happen. We're confident that that kind of transformation will occur. And in the meanwhile, the construction contractor consumes a lot of fossil fuel, his costs are going up, but so is every other contractors. And those prices are going to flow through the economy. And remember, the consumers of those goods are going to have more money because it's coming back to them in the form of a dividend. The place where the change occurs is the innovative general contractor or heavy construction operator who says, hey, if I buy a hybrid excavator rather than a traditional diesel excavator, I can reduce my carbon footprint, reduce my fossil fuel fees, reduce my costs overall, and be better off. So, you know, I mean, it's going to be a transformation, and some guys are going to get there sooner than others. Somebody's going to be the new John D. Rockefeller of this future economy. And not everybody's going to get there the same way. But that's the way free enterprise works. And that's the way we want it to work, I think. At least I do.
Just to add to that, New Holland, which manufactures tractors, they've already developed a hydrogen fuel cell tractor. And they are testing it out. It's been around for several years now. They're testing it out. They're not going to mass produce it until they see a market for it. And that's not going to happen until there's a price on fossil carbon.
Exactly. Perfect example. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I do like your ideas, and I was going to wonder, since you're leading into it anyway, if in the small model you're talking about has been tried maybe by whatever the country is that is most progressive.
So are you asking, has a carbon fee and dividend been implemented anywhere?
Well, or some small version of it, yes.
Yeah, not so far as I'm aware. We know that there are carbon taxes that have been applied in a number of places. I mean, goodness, Sweden has had a carbon tax on power plants since the mid-1990s, and it's working to control carbon emissions there. But that's not a carbon fee and dividend. So that's a different approach. That's one where government, applies a tax and keeps the money. Our proposal, the government does not keep the money, government does not grow, government doesn't tell you how to behave. So, sorry, I mean, we'd love for there to be a test case out there that we could point to. I'm not aware of anyone, so I don't think one exists yet. Somebody's going to be first. and it'll be exciting when we get there.
Will the dividend be distributed on a per capita basis or some other basis?
Yeah, oh, great question. I don't think I made that clear at all. All of the revenues will be divided equally per capita and distributed by households. You know, that's the principle at work here. Children would get half of the dividend of an adult and distributed by households. You know, people can sometimes ask us, you know, who's going to do that? What are the details of how that gets administered and distributed and so forth? And, you know, those details are not really part of our policy, but to paint a picture, for instance, I think you might imagine that as part of your federal income tax return, you would receive the dividend. You know, that would either offset your federal income taxes, or, you know, if you had no federal income taxes, you'd get a dividend check from the IRS. And maybe it comes quarterly rather than yearly. Maybe it becomes monthly rather than quarterly. You know, all of those things are details that would be worked out, and all of them are possibilities. Revenue is going to be coming in every day from, you know, where it's extracted from the ground. And, you know, it'll be accumulated in an account someplace, and the government will divide by 315 million or whatever our population is, and here's your share. You know, they do this in Alaska, right? I mean, something like it. It's the energy fund that they have, and every family in Alaska gets their cut every year. So I mean, it's not unlike that sort of thing. Oh, here, yeah.
I have a question about how this might be implemented. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like we could start with California and New York and proceed incrementally. Do you have some ideas on how you might
Okay.
do this?
Yeah, there's another goof in my introduction. I didn't mention that we perceive this as federal legislation. This would apply nationwide all at once. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but the kind of the kind of issue that you see with the border adjustments between the U.S. and internationally, those same kind of issues would pertain if you try to do it on a state-by-state issue across state boundaries. So, you know, we want a level playing field. We want everybody in this together, and if we think that's the way it works.
Well, I just wonder why corporations also receive dividends.
But because corporations are not people. Don't laugh.
And yet they use fuels. They have to purchase gasoline just like people do.
Yeah, okay, and the answer is, you know, I said that tongue in cheek, but I think the answer is because, you know, this comes back to the people, to the households. If you give it to corporations, it needs to flow back to the households in the end anyway. So there's plenty of advantages for corporations to succeed, I think.
They just pass the cost on down to the consumer.
Yeah, I see. Well, and what I was trying to say is if they got a benefit, they would pass their benefits back out to the shareholders as well. So it's, you know, 6 of 1, half dozen. Why make it complicated? Keep it simple. Question in the back.
Of course, you're always concerned about unintended consequences. I was curious if this would, I mean, if this works in the United States, the BRIC countries, the rest of the world, are waiting to take up all the slack that we create. Has anyone thought about how to deal with all the rest of the countries like India or...
I'm sorry, which slack? I don't understand.
So if we reduce our demand for fossil fuels, will the developing countries simply take up every bit that we let go of and keep it going?
So let me read back to you to see if I understand your question. I'm going to put this in economic terms. If we reduce our fossil fuel consumption, that's a significant reduction in world demand for fossil fuel. Prices would tend to fall. And so the other consumers around the world, particularly because the prices are lower, are going to consume more.
Right. Maybe the waiting market.
That's the vision. Okay. Well, my answer to that is embedded in in the border adjustment idea. People who want to sell to the United States, the largest and most dynamic market on earth, are going to be stimulated to adopt this policy at home. Does that prove that they'll do it? No, it doesn't. It's going to give them a lot of economic incentive to do so, though. The picture you paint there of everybody else sort of glomming onto a surplus supply of fossil fuel is also going to be mitigated by the likes of the Paris Climate Accord, in which 190 countries have signed on to meet commitments to reduce their fossil fuel. And some of those places are going to do it like we do here for the reasons I've said. Others are going to do it by regulation or by central planning or whatever. But you look at what's happening in India and China, and if you're watching that, both India and China are making dramatic moves to reduce their CO2 emissions. It's true that China exceeds U.S. CO2 emissions today. They passed us a few years ago, and they're continuing to increase for a while. But they're on a curve to flatten and reduce. We need to, we want to lead that charge here in the United States. At least I do. Okay?
Question about the border adjustment. So what's to stop big oil companies just selling overseas and avoiding the whole tax? And then having other overseas companies sell to America and avoiding that way also? Overseas
selling to America. Well, the moment an erg of fossil fuel comes in the United States, it gets the fee applied. So, nobody's going to sell fossil fuel energy in the United States without the fee, regardless of where it's extracted. In terms of, keeping the fee on U.S.-produced fossil fuel that is exported, under this border adjustment, that would not happen. That's a permutation that could be considered, I guess I'd say. Under our basic concept, that wouldn't apply. So. Question? Speak up. We don't need the mic.
How would you, if a company from outside the United States comes to you and has a product and says, oh yeah, I use solar panels to build this product, how are you going to tell the difference versus them using petroleum to build that product?
There will be some analysis and some inspection sort of activity required. I think that's a subtlety and a complication that will demand some attention. I think you have an approach that I'd like you to share.
One way to determine the tariff on these imports is to take the country that's exporting into the U.S., take that country's total use of fossil carbon, which we can get from, that's already reported, their extraction and their imports, and calculate that, and then also take their total gross domestic product. And the ratio of that we would call the carbon intensity of the economy, and just apply that uniform ratio to the market value of every import to the U.S. And that doesn't credit, individual companies that might use solar in that country, but it does give incentive to that country to reduce its aggregate fossil fuel use, to whatever means it uses.
Good, thank you. Okay, back here.
How does this proposal differ from a similar initiative that the state had last year, or the year before, that was unfortunately defeated?
Yeah.
And how does it differ from another proposal by a group called Citizens for Jobs and Clean Energy that right now preparing a new initiative?
Right, the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. Well, first off, this is federal, it's not state, and I think that we asked a question earlier, that's an important difference. The other difference that I would state is that I-732, which failed at the ballot box last November, was designed to be revenue neutral. And I think that the designers of the law did the very best that they could to do that. Much of it was a tax swap. Some of the revenue was retained for certain offsets for energy-intensive industries and low-income families and so forth. So that's a difference. It's not as purely revenue neutral as we believe CFD is. And we think that's important in order to obtain broad political support for it. The ideals of small government, individual responsibility, free markets, free enterprise, all of those things are pretty much fundamental to the CFD approach, and it reduces CO2 emissions, and it protects low-income families because the dividend is actually a greater benefit to low-income families than the fee is. They're actually better off with a CFD than a non-revenue carbon tax, for instance. So I hope that's a fair answer. We could talk about that for hours, I think. The Alliance's proposal is, as far as I'm aware, indefinite, but Jen may know more about that. We don't know exactly what they're going to propose yet.
It will be revenue generating, which is very different from a revenue neutral policy. And that generated revenue will go to dedicated projects, not back to the general public.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah. One more question on CFD, then we're going to continue, and we'll come back to a general discussion on the, all related matters. Any other questions on CFD? Okay, I'm going to keep going here.
Wait, one more.
Oh.
Has anyone given consideration to a methane fee?
Probably. I can't say what CCL's position is. Steve?
Actually, the CCL plan does address fossil methane, like leakage from gas wells, and that is charged. But there are also methane emissions from cows and manure that are not addressed.
Okay, I'm going to move on, and any CFD questions that remain, we can take them in the general discussion or afterwards. We'll linger here as long as anybody wants to talk. So what about this CFD? I claim that it's not going to affect people's standard of living individually, or the economy at large, the strength of the U.S. economy. So what evidence do I have of that? Well, there's a study that was commissioned by a third party, Regional Economic Models Incorporated. We refer to it as REMI, a high-powered think tank that does very sophisticated economic analysis. They considered dozens of individual sectors in the U.S. economy and evaluated the effects of this CFD policy on those sectors and on different regions of the country by region. You can go look at that report and find a huge amount of data. And I don't want to belabor it because it goes on and on and on, but here's a summary of the essential results. You see that we actually create more jobs, more than 2 million additional jobs in 10 years than under a baseline case. And here I'm not talking about 2 million more jobs than we have today. I'm talking about 2 million more jobs than we would have if we maintained current policies. So it's actually a greater job growth than with current kinds of policies. Emissions cut in half, that's our main objective, of course. And overall, the economy is stronger, more powerful, larger than it would be otherwise. So everything's going good. And oh, by the way, we saved 13,000 lives because of the reduction in CO2 pollution. So let's not collide here, right? So I'm going to take a couple slides here and talk about the conservative perspective on this. I don't want to leave the impression that this is a conservative proposal. The reason I'm talking about this a little bit is because many people believe that action to eliminate climate change through reduced fossil fuel emissions is strictly a liberal or progressive ideal. And I want to share with you some perspective that that's not true, that there are a lot of conservatives. Some of them, I would refer to as graybeards or luminaries in the conservative Republican sort of movement. So, and one example is George Shultz. George is the only fellow in history who has been Secretary of Labor, of State, Secretary of State, and Secretary of the Treasury, as well as Director of Office of Management and Budget. So he's held all those jobs in 3 different Republican administrations. If it's not a tax, it's not a tax if government doesn't keep the money, okay? So government doesn't grow, give it back to the people. And then conversely, it's accepted, even amongst conservative economics dogma, that if you want to change behavior, put a tax on it. And there's dozens of economists of all stripes who have supported a tax on fossil fuel CO2 emissions in order to reduce that. We're not talking about a tax like George says. We're talking about a fee and a dividend, but the idea is the same. Change behavior by putting a price on it. There's a group called the Climate Leadership Council that's comprised of this set of Republican luminaries. Hopefully you recognize many of those names. A lot of them are so-called Reagan Republicans. They've been prominent in our national scene for decades, and they are all lined up with a policy that is so close to what I've described to you as carbon fee and dividend that it's almost indistinguishable. And right here in our region, the Spokesman Review has come out and said the proposal by this Climate Leadership Council is worth looking at. Republicans, or conservatives, and specifically Republicans, should consider this policy very, very seriously because it looks like a good one. More examples of the nonpartisan, or in this case bipartisan, approach that we in CCL are so completely dedicated to. There is plenty of evidence that a number of Republicans are coming on board with this idea. There's a group in the House called the Climate Solutions Caucus. As you see now, it's comprised of 60 members of Congress. By definition, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. They have to join this caucus in bipartisan pairs because this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that requires all of the Americans to work together on, and that's what this caucus is dedicated to. That 60 members is 3 times the size that it was on election day last year. It's growing dramatically. We almost can't keep this chart current. It's changed since we potted this presentation before we started the tour. We had to update it since we've been on the road. Another example is there's a resolution in Congress that only Republicans can sign on to. House Resolution 195, if you want to Google it. And here's a list of the signatories so far. The resolution says that the climate is changing, that humans cause it, and that Congress needs to research ways to deal with it that do not damage the economy. Okay? So, the idea that Republicans or conservatives are monolithic and they don't believe in dealing with climate change is wrong. There's a lot we do want to do something about it. We had a great question a little bit earlier about construction operators, and I already spoke when I answered that question to many of the same issues that we think pertain to farmers. We're particularly sensitive to farmers in the ag economy here in Washington State. We know that farming is a critical industrial sector to our economy, and particularly in this part of the state, it's what our economy is based on. So making sure that farmers are not damaged in this process is critical. The border adjustment is part of that. We know that 80% of wheat grown in Washington State is exported, so those people need to be made whole when they export their markets, and those markets are not destroyed by carbon prices. Border adjustment helps with that, same with apples.
which are exported, but fossil fuel production for the internal U.S. markets needs to get more expensive, so we stimulate people moving off of fossil fuels, and that includes farmers. And for the reasons we've stated, we think that's a future that is not that hard to visualize. Some guys are going to get there sooner than others. Some guys are going to figure out how to make that movement and thrive in the new economy. Yeah, others not so much. So, anyway, there are some ideas that hopefully you can think about. We hope we've stimulated your thought about this one particular proposal. But there's other things that you can do. I want to talk just a moment about Citizens Climate Lobby. As I said, we're a group of individual volunteers, nonpartisan by definition. And we are not political, but we are focused on interacting with our individual members of Congress everywhere across the country. It's actually an international organization with 86,000 volunteers at this point, and it's doubling about every year. 450 chapters around the world, the overwhelming majority of them here in the U.S. But one of the things that we're dedicated to is interacting with our members of Congress, actively lobbying them. But I'm talking about individual citizens, not professional paid lobbyists. And I want to point out at this time, one of the things that you can do to help us is when we lobby our members of Congress, you have a comment form that was laid on your sheet. This is an opportunity to weigh in with our member of Congress here. We're in Ellensburg, so I guess we're in Dave Reichert's district. Did I get that right? And we will deliver these comment forms in your behalf. If you prefer to mail them yourself, you're welcome to do that. But this is just one kind of example of the sorts of things you can do. We believe in the democratic process. We believe in nonpartisan action, treating everybody with respect, and in letting our members of Congress know our feelings, because we know that when a bunch of us speak up, they pay attention. They actually will change their positions based on a groundswell of input from people. So comment form is one example. You can work on your own at all times to call your Congress people, email your Congress people. It's really easy to do on the web these days. Those things actually make a difference. You can join with CCL, and we'd love for you to. I think we've got sign-up forms in back, and hopefully you've all signed up so you can learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby and Audubon, Washington, and other organizations. One of the things that I would say about CCL that's really exciting is the fact of meeting together in a group and stimulating your ideas with other people who have similar ideas, and helping one another take the right kinds of actions and behave the right kinds of ways with your behavior. We don't have a CCL chapter in Ellensburg yet, but we want one. So hopefully, this meeting might serve to stimulate that. But letters to the editor, lots of things you can do, and it's easy to be, kind of passive about it, to say, well, what can I do as an individual? But there's lots of things you can do, and the comment form is an easy one for you to do today. Jen?
Thank you. Part of Audubon's mission is also to build durable public will. And like I said at the beginning, we also recognize ourselves as a bipartisan, or rather, should I say, non-partisan organization. And we really believe that birds help us tell that message. Birds are a non-partisan species, and they help us talk about climate change without even using the words climate change. So we are also building durable public will and bringing up future leaders, future climate leaders. So if you're interested in joining the climate action fight in Washington State or elsewhere, I encourage you to fill out this form on your chair and just rip off the perforated piece, leave the red piece for me at the back, and keep the blue one for yourself. We will probably, we will be having a lobby day in Olympia in January, and we will be lobbying on behalf of climate action. We work at the local, state, and federal levels, and CFD is one policy that Audubon would support. We supported 732 last year. We'll support the Alliance if they move forward, but we ask for your help in this, using your voice for birds and for people too. And I'll also say that the local chapter, Cititzens Audubon Society, has a climate change committee on it. So I would encourage you to talk to the gal in the yellow shirt over there afterwards if you're interested in learning more about some of the actions that are taking locally right here in your backyard. So we've talked enough. Obviously there's lots to talk about. One more math for you. You know, 71 or 74% of your neighbors think that taking action on climate is a good thing. Regulating a pollutant, just like we pay to put out our garbage or clean our waters. How about we pay to emit those carbon emissions? People agree, but nobody's talking about it. 38% in Cititzens County. So please, go into your community and start having these conversations and spreading the word and letting people know that it's not too scary to take action. You don't even have to use the word climate change. Just talk about the birds. Just talk about the birds. And so we'd like to open it up for general conversation and more questions. And we will do our best to engage. Thank you so much.